I remember the exact moment he walked through the door. Not because it was dramatic or theatrical. It wasn't. No suitcase rolling behind him, no long-lost hugs or exclamations of surprise. Just a simple nod, a shy smile, and a dry, hey, like he was stepping into a life that hadn't waited for him. But something in the air shifted, something too quiet to name. He had grown. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he was a lanky teenager visiting one summer. And now, tall, lean, wearing a worn gray t-shirt that clung slightly to his chest from the heat, his jaw faintly shadowed, he looked more like a man who could rent a car than someone who'd once played with Legos on my living room floor. He was here for the summer, my husband's nephew, helping with furniture restoration, staying in the guest room, eating at our table. It was all pre-decided, agreed upon without me, and I hadn't protested. I never did. Our house had always been a quiet place, more organized than warm, but it functioned well. We functioned well. The first few days were filled with the usual: polite conversations over coffee, shared glances over dinner, brief nods in the hallway. I noticed things I shouldn't have. How he dried his hands slowly after washing them. The way his collarbone moved under his skin when he reached up to grab something from a high shelf. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was just paying attention because he was new in the house, unfamiliar. But that wasn't true. One morning, my husband had already left for work. The kitchen smelled like fresh peaches and cinnamon. I had been making muffins. He entered barefoot, his hair slightly damp from a quick shower, his eyes still hazy from sleep. There was something unsettling in the way he moved. Not provocative, not even aware. Just natural. At ease with his body, with space. He leaned against the counter, yawning, and said, "You look like someone who knows how to make mornings better." I didn't respond immediately. I stirred the batter slower than necessary, eyes on the bowl. My pulse had changed. Quiet, but erratic. When I finally looked at him, I smiled. The kind of smile you give a stranger who's about to become too familiar. "Just muffins," I said. It wasn't just muffins. It was the dress I chose that morning, a light cotton thing that hugged me at the waist. I told myself it was because of the weather, but there had been other dresses in the closet, looser ones, safer ones. That evening, I found myself changing again. A second outfit, as if the first had somehow gotten it wrong. I didn't know why. Or maybe I did. The silk camisole I wore under my sweater had no business being on a Wednesday night with no plans to leave the house. But the thought of him seeing the outline of lace, even by accident, made my skin tingle. Later, I stood in the hallway listening. My husband was upstairs on a conference call. The guest room door creaked slightly open. Light spilled into the corridor in a soft golden strip. He was inside, sketching something at the desk. Head down. Focused. I watched him for 3 seconds longer than I should have. He didn't see me. I turned away before the fourth. I started to invent excuses. "Could you help me carry this into the garage? Do you think this chair could be restored? Does this lamp look crooked?" Little things. Domestic, harmless on the surface. But beneath them, something throbbed. One afternoon, we were in the backyard tending to the rose bushes. He was digging, hands deep in the soil, sweat tracing along his jaw. I was watering the plants, though more water ended up on my sandals than the roots. He stood up, brushed the dirt off his palms, and walked over to me. "You missed a few," he said, gesturing toward the dry leaves. "I like imperfect things," I replied without thinking. He looked at me for a moment too long. "Yeah," he said finally. "I can tell." That night, I showered longer than usual. I scrubbed every inch of skin as though preparing for something, though nothing was planned. I chose a darker shade of lipstick, then wiped it off. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror, not because of age or fatigue, but because I was studying myself as if through someone else's eyes. His, perhaps. The turning point came quietly. He was in the kitchen again, reaching for a glass on the top shelf. His shirt lifted slightly, revealing a strip of skin, narrow, taut. I was behind him, putting dishes away. Too close. He stepped back without looking and brushed against my arm. A touch. Brief. Electric. He didn't apologize. He just stood still, and so did I. It meant nothing. And yet it did. It meant everything that hadn't been spoken. Later that evening, I passed by the guest room again. His door was ajar, and he was on the phone. I didn't mean to listen. I was just walking by. But his voice was soft, lower than usual. "No, I don't think I'll go anywhere this summer," he said. "I like it here. It's different here." I stopped breathing for a second. Different how? Because of the beach nearby? The quiet dinners? Or was it me? I stepped away before he saw me. In bed, next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling. His breathing was steady. I reached for his hand under the blanket, laced my fingers through his. It was warm, familiar, but my body didn't respond. Not with disgust, not even resentment. Just nothing. Like holding a photograph of a moment instead of the moment itself. That's when I knew. I wasn't drifting away. I was already gone. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to come back. Tomorrow we would both be in the kitchen again. He'd say something casual. I'd laugh. And it would all begin again. A little deeper, a little closer, a slow unraveling. Not planned, not spoken, but inevitable. The next morning was disturbingly ordinary. I woke up first, as always. The kitchen light felt too harsh, the windows were fogged with condensation, behind which the garden slept quietly in shades of green and gray. I opened the fridge without thinking, pulled out the eggs and milk, and reached for the same chipped mug I always used, the one I never quite managed to replace. Everything I did was familiar. Setting the pan on the stove, brushing my finger along the edge of the counter, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. But something inside me pulsed with an energy I couldn't contain. The space around me felt dense, as though it breathed with me. Or with him. He walked in barefoot, wearing a soft gray t-shirt and dark sweatpants. His hair was slightly messy, still damp from a quick shower. He looked entirely at ease in his body, unaware of how each movement pulled the air around him tighter. He went to the sink, poured himself a glass of water. Nothing happened. And yet, everything did. "Morning," he said, voice low, a little husky. I nodded, answering softly. Just another morning. But my fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the mug, and he noticed. "You okay?" I smiled, trying not to meet his gaze. "Didn't sleep much?" I said. "Too much coffee last night, maybe." He didn't believe me, I could tell, but he didn't push. We were already speaking in a shared language of avoidance, suggestion, carefully placed silences. He sat at the table, casually crossing one leg over the other, his foot nearly brushing against mine under the table. I felt the warmth of his presence as if it were a physical thing. And then, just as I turned to face the stove, he said, "You wear that dress a lot?" I froze for a heartbeat. The dress was dark blue, soft cotton, fitted at the waist with a slightly open neckline, modest but intentional. The kind of dress you wear when you want to feel your own shape. "It's comfortable," I said after a pause. "Why?" He shrugged and lifted his gaze to mine. It was the first time I really saw him look at me. Not just glance, but look. "You look different in it," he said. I turned away, not from shame, but because if I had stayed in that moment a second longer, I might have walked to him, sat closer, let the day veer into something we couldn't come back from. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The rest of the day became a silent agreement to keep our distance. I left the house for a few hours, claiming we were out of salt and paper napkins, but I spent most of the time walking aimlessly through the aisles of the grocery store, picking up things I didn't need. My thoughts weren't thoughts anymore, just sensations. His skin, his voice, the weight of his eyes. When I returned, he was in the backyard working on an old wooden chair. He was crouched low, sanding the edges with smooth, confident strokes. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway. Sweat dampened the fabric at his back. The way his shoulders moved had rhythm, and I stood at the door for a moment just watching. I brought him a glass of water. "Thanks," he said, taking it from my hands. His fingers brushed mine, slightly calloused, warm. He drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then looked at me. Not down at the chair, not toward the tools, but at me. "I think it'll hold," he said, nodding at the chair. "I hope so," I replied. "It's older than our marriage." He raised an eyebrow. "How long have you been together?" 17 years. He paused. "That long?" "Feels longer some days, shorter on others." He smiled, but there was something unreadable in his face. "You don't seem old enough for 17 years of anything." "That's kind of you," I said, trying to sound amused. But my voice didn't quite reach where it needed to, because behind his words was something deeper. A question. A recognition. And in mine. An answer I didn't want to admit out loud. Later that evening, I took an unusually long shower. I used the lotion I save for special occasions. I wore the black lace underneath my pajamas. Not for him to see, of course. Just because. Just in case. It was nearly midnight when I wandered downstairs. I said I couldn't sleep. Maybe I couldn't. Or maybe I needed to see if he was still awake. He was in the living room, lying on the couch with a book. No lights, just the soft lamp behind him. The room looked like something out of a memory. Familiar, quiet, dim. He sat up slightly. "Can't sleep?" I shook my head. "You?" He held up the book. "I'm rereading something I don't understand. Thought maybe the second time would help." I smiled, walked further into the room. Sometimes the second time makes it worse. He tilted his head, studying me. "You look different tonight." I didn't ask how. I sat down on the edge of the armchair. There was silence between us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something dense and rising. I turned my head toward him, ready to say something casual, harmless, but I didn't get the chance. He leaned forward slowly, as if testing the weight of the air. And then it happened. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't even a kiss at first. Just the meeting of breath and heat and the faintest brush of mouths. His hand cupped my cheek, hesitant, reverent. Our lips barely moved, but something inside me broke open. I didn't pull away. I didn't panic. I just let myself feel. Then he stood up, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He didn't look at me when he whispered, "I'm sorry," and walked upstairs. I stayed on the couch, fingertips still pressed to my lips. I didn't move. I couldn't. There was no regret, only shock. Not from what had happened, but from how much I had wanted it. And tomorrow we would look at each other and pretend. Pretend we were still only relatives, still only guests in each other's lives. But I knew better. Because once your mouth has known someone else's, everything changes. And I already wanted more. He didn't look at me during breakfast. Not out of shame or discomfort. It wasn't that. He was polite, quiet, responsive when spoken to. But something in the way he held his body had shifted, as if he was trying not to take up too much space, as if he was trying not to make it worse. I watched him from across the table, my fingers idly turning the spoon in my coffee. The kiss hovered between us, not mentioned, but undeniably present. It had settled into the air like humidity, making every word, every movement feel heavier. My husband sat between us, reading something on his phone, oblivious. His presence was a buffer, a wall neither of us could cross, but also the thing that made the memory of last night unbearably vivid. After breakfast, my husband packed for a short business trip. An out-of-town client he needed to meet in person. It wasn't a surprise. He'd mentioned it a few days ago, and I had nodded, made the necessary adjustments to our schedule. At the time, it had felt like nothing. Now, the thought of being alone in the house with him again, with the nephew, for an entire week tightened something low in my stomach, a mix of thrill and dread. My husband kissed me lightly on the cheek before leaving, said something about traffic, and grabbed his overnight bag. He didn't notice the way my hand lingered on the edge of the table after he closed the door. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He never did. When I turned back toward the kitchen, he was standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The silence had weight now, a new shape. It wrapped itself around us, not threatening, but undeniable. He walked past me to get a glass of water, and I felt his presence move through the room like wind. He was close enough to touch, yet further than ever. "Do you want me to go somewhere for a few days?" he asked, his voice low, careful. "No," I said too quickly, then paused. It's not necessary." He nodded but didn't press. He didn't need to. The very fact that he offered meant he was already thinking what I was trying not to. That being in the same space again would make it impossible not to remember, not to want. That afternoon, he set up in the backyard again, working on a small wooden chest we'd found at a flea market months ago and never restored. I watched him through the window while folding laundry, or pretending to. His arms moved rhythmically, his face concentrated, a faint crease between his brows as he sanded the surface with care. There was something about the way he worked, the precision, the patience, that made me ache. My husband was a man of efficiency. Everything in our life had a purpose, a function, a reason. Even our intimacy, when it happened, felt scheduled, reliable, not bad, not unpleasant, just empty of surprise, of wonder. I walked outside without thinking. The heat wrapped around me like a blanket, and the scent of cut grass and sawdust filled the air. I approached slowly, barefoot, holding a glass of lemonade. "You've been out here for hours," I said. He looked up, squinting slightly in the sun. "Didn't notice." I handed him the drink. Our fingers touched again, and this time neither of us flinched. "You're good at this," I said. He took a sip and smiled faintly. "It's the only thing that slows my thoughts down." "And what are you thinking about when they're not slow?" He paused, looked at me. The expression on his face made it clear he was debating whether or not to answer honestly. Then, carefully, "You." I didn't look away. I should have. But I didn't. We stood in the shade, the space between us shrinking even though our feet hadn't moved. I felt my heart beating in strange places, wrists, knees, the base of my throat. "You shouldn't say things like that," I whispered. But it's true. Truth in that moment was dangerous, not because it would ruin lives, but because it would break the silence we were both clinging to. A silence that protected us from the fire burning quietly under the surface. Later that day, I suggested we have dinner outside. The air had cooled, the light turning golden as it filtered through the trees. I lit candles, set out napkins, uncorked a bottle of wine we had been saving for nothing in particular. He offered to cook, grilled vegetables and fish, and I didn't stop him. We didn't talk much, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt suspended, like the pause between two lines of music. At one point, I caught him watching me. I was reaching for something across the table, and I felt his eyes trace the line of my collarbone, the curve of my shoulder. I felt it like heat against my skin. And for a second, I didn't breathe. "You look beautiful tonight," he said. I laughed, not out of disbelief, but because it felt dangerous to believe it, to let that truth in. And yet it wrapped around me, soft and unwelcome. After dinner, I started gathering the dishes, but he stopped me. "Come with me," he said. I hesitated. "Where?" "Just come." We walked behind the house where the old garage had been converted into a kind of studio space. My husband rarely used it. It was cluttered with odds and ends. Unfinished furniture, boxes of forgotten things, half-dried paint cans. He opened the door, and inside it was dark, quiet, filled with the smell of wood and varnish. He turned on a single lamp in the corner. The light fell across a canvas propped against the far wall. I hadn't known he painted. It was me. Not precisely, not in a portrait sense. But the shape was unmistakable. The tilt of my head, the curve of my back, caught in the act of reaching for something invisible. My hair loose, my posture unguarded. It was not a woman posing. It was a woman unaware. "You painted this?" I asked, voice smaller than I wanted it to be. He nodded. "When?" He hesitated. "The first night, when I couldn't sleep." I turned away because the weight of it was too much. Because there was something sacred in being seen like that. Not dressed up, not made up, but seen. "You can't keep doing this," I said, barely above a whisper. "Doing what?" "Making it harder not to feel everything." Silence. And then, so quietly, "I know." When we left the studio, the air outside felt cooler. My skin prickled, though not from the wind. We didn't touch. We didn't kiss. But as I lay in bed that night, the image of the painting burned behind my eyes. It wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about lust. It was about being noticed, completely, quietly, without demand. My husband had never seen me like that, not in 17 years. And now I couldn't stop wondering what else I had been missing, or what else he might give. He was in the garage again the next morning. I knew without even looking. I could hear the rhythm of his movements, the scrape of sandpaper, the low hum of music through his earbuds, the occasional pause when he stepped outside to stretch or get more tools. The door remained half open, the way he always left it. An invitation, though neither of us acknowledged it as such. I moved slowly through my morning, as though trying to stay behind the clock. I lingered in the shower longer than usual, shaved carefully, moisturized every inch of my skin like I was preparing for something ceremonial. My wardrobe felt strange that day. I stood in front of the closet for too long, eyes sliding across cotton dresses, linen trousers, neutral blouses that spoke of errands and practicality. I reached for a cream-colored top that buttoned up the front. Soft, sheer enough to hint at the black lace underneath, but not enough to cross any visible line. When I finally stepped outside, the sun was high. He was crouched beside an old dresser, painting delicate lines into the drawer handles. He didn't hear me approach. "You've been out here all morning," I said, leaning against the doorway. He looked up, squinting slightly. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. "Time moves differently when I'm focused." I nodded, unsure what to say next. The air between us was no longer tense. It had turned into something quieter, more dangerous. Familiarity with heat, knowing it would burn but still reaching for it, because the warmth had started to feel essential. "I was thinking of driving out to that antique place," I said after a pause. "The one near the old train station. They might have a few pieces I could use for a client." He wiped his hands on a rag and stood. "You want company?" The way he asked it was deliberate, not casual, not playful. There was a gravity to his voice that I hadn't heard before. He wasn't testing me. He was offering a moment we couldn't undo. "Yes," I said. "I do." We didn't speak much during the drive. The car was filled with the sound of passing wind, the occasional song drifting from the radio. I focused on the road, though I was acutely aware of his presence beside me. The way his knee occasionally brushed against the console, how his hand rested on his thigh just a little too close to mine. When we reached the shop, I was grateful for the distraction of dusty furniture and worn leather-bound books. The place was a maze of half-forgotten items, each piece holding some stranger's history. We walked slowly through it, sometimes separating, sometimes drifting back toward each other without noticing. I stopped in front of a mirror, tall, old, its edges slightly chipped. I looked at my reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were too bright, her mouth too tense. There was a flush across her cheeks that wasn't from the heat. He stepped beside me. That mirror doesn't do you justice. I didn't answer. I was afraid if I did, my voice would crack under the weight of everything unspoken. Later, as we loaded a small chair and a lamp into the back of the car, he asked if I wanted to get lunch. There was a small diner nearby, one of those places frozen in time with faded red booths and laminated menus. We sat by the window, the sun casting strips of light across our table. He watched me as I stirred sugar into my tea, his gaze unwavering. "You're quiet." "I have too many thoughts in my head," I said, "and not enough space to keep them there." He leaned forward slightly. "Then say one out loud." I looked at him, and something inside me slipped, like a lock turning slowly, without resistance. "I don't feel like myself anymore," I said, "and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a very bad one." His voice was low. "Maybe it's just the first time you're actually seeing yourself." The words hung between us, heavier than the heat pressing through the glass. The drive back was longer, slower. I don't remember what we passed, only that my heart began to beat differently. I glanced at him once, and he was already looking at me. He didn't smile, didn't look away. That gaze stayed with me even when we pulled into the driveway. Inside, the house felt cooler, darker, as though it had missed us. I placed the chair in the corner of the living room and reached for the lamp. My fingers brushed against his as he handed it over. That simple contact sent something sharp and immediate through me. I froze. So did he. He stepped closer. "I think about you all the time," he said quietly, barely above a whisper. "Even when I try not to." My breath caught. My hands were still holding the lamp, but my body had gone entirely still. "I wake up thinking about how you stir your coffee, how you laugh when you're distracted, the way your shoulders move when you stretch in the morning." He took another step. "It's not just desire. It's not that simple." I let go of the lamp and backed toward the wall, needing the support of something solid. His words had dismantled whatever careful lines I had drawn in my mind. "You shouldn't say these things," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "But they're true," he replied, "and I think you feel them too." I closed my eyes. I wanted to pretend I didn't. I wanted to pretend I could step away, unburned. "You think I haven't noticed?" he continued. "How you touch your hair when I enter a room. How your voice changes when you say my name. You think I haven't seen the way your hands shake when we're close?" I opened my eyes, and there he was. Close again. Too close. And I didn't move. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, softer now. "I just needed you to know that I see you. All of you. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever known." That night, I went to bed before him. I didn't trust myself to stay awake, not after what he'd said. My husband had called earlier, a brief check-in, his voice distant and distracted. I told him everything was fine. I didn't lie. Not exactly. But I lay awake for hours. The sheets were cold against my skin, and I could still feel his words like fingerprints along my spine. Sleep didn't come. Only the image of him standing in that fading light, telling me things I'd never heard from the man I'd built my life with. I thought about the drive, the diner, the antique store, the mirror, the woman in the reflection. Unfamiliar, aching, alive. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of her. I wanted to become her. The rain came without warning. Not a soft drizzle. Not the gentle patter that settles into background noise. It was a sudden, heavy downpour, loud against the windows, wild and disordered. The sky had darkened so quickly that I didn't have time to bring in the cushions from the patio or the basket of folded laundry left on the porch swing. But none of it mattered. Not that day. I found him outside, soaked to the skin, struggling to cover the unfinished dresser with a plastic sheet. The water clung to his shirt, translucent now, molded to the lines of his back, his shoulders, his chest. His hair was plastered against his forehead, droplets running in rivulets down his jaw, his neck. He looked like a painting in motion, something between defiance and surrender. I didn't call out. I didn't offer an umbrella. I just watched him through the glass, and every part of my body felt like it had been set alight. When he finally came inside, dripping and breathless, he found me standing in the kitchen. I was barefoot, wearing only a thin cardigan over my camisole and leggings. I hadn't even realized I'd removed my bra when I changed earlier. Or maybe I had. I don't remember anymore what was accidental and what was intentional. Our eyes met. There was no small talk. No polite laugh about the weather. Just silence. The kind that has an edge to it. He pulled his shirt off over his head, slowly, and dropped it onto the tile floor with a wet slap. My breath caught. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His skin was flushed from the cold, and his chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. "Give me a towel," he said quietly. I nodded, moved to the linen closet just off the hallway. My hands shook slightly as I opened the cabinet. The towels were stacked neatly. White, clean, all the same. I chose the softest one and walked back toward him. He didn't take it from me. Instead, he stood still as I approached, and I did what I hadn't let myself do before. I reached up and pressed the towel against his skin. First his shoulders, then his chest. I moved slowly, deliberately, aware of every inch between us, every inch I was closing. His breath hitched when my hand brushed against his side. I felt the heat of him, the electricity humming under his skin. And I knew, in that exact moment, that something irreversible was going to happen. I dropped the towel on the counter. He stepped forward, so close that I could smell the rain still clinging to his body. Earthy, clean, electric. His hand found my hip, hesitated. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the storm outside. "I need to know this isn't just in my head," he whispered. "It's not," I answered. His lips met mine. There was no hesitation this time, no testing the waters. The kiss was deep, unrelenting. It stole the breath from my lungs, burned through my nerves like fire through dry leaves. His hands found the sides of my face, pulled me closer, and I let myself fall into him. Into the moment, the feeling, the decision I'd already made long before this night. When we finally broke apart, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. Outside, the rain continued, but in here, something else had broken open. "I'm sorry," he said, and yet his eyes told me he wasn't. "I'm not," I replied, and I wasn't, not even a little. We didn't speak after that for a long time. He picked up his shirt from the floor and disappeared down the hallway. I stayed by the counter, palms flat against the wood, eyes fixed on nothing. Everything in my body was alive, tingling, afraid, excited. I felt younger than I had in years, and more dangerous. Later that evening, after the rain had calmed to a soft drizzle, I walked out onto the porch to bring in the laundry I'd forgotten. Most of it was soaked beyond saving, but I didn't care. The air was cool now, damp with the scent of wet earth and pine. The sky was the color of bruised lilac, low and stretched wide. He stepped out behind me. I didn't turn. "You didn't have to say it," he said. "Say what?" "That you're not sorry. I already knew." I turned then, slowly, and looked at him. "You think that makes it better?" "No," he said, "but it makes it real." We stood in silence again. The kind of silence that only exists when the truth has been spoken. There was no going back. Not after that. "I should feel guilty," I murmured. "Do you?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. The house was too quiet that night. My husband had called around 9, said he was staying one more day to finish up some paperwork. I pretended to be disappointed. Said something about leftover lasagna. He laughed, told me he missed me. I stared at the phone long after the call ended. The screen darkened. My reflection stared back. In the mirror later, I studied my own face. The soft swelling of my lips, the faint flush across my chest, the way my skin still remembered his touch. I wore a navy blue silk nightgown that clung to my body in places that used to feel forgotten. I hadn't worn it in years. I'd told myself it was too cold, too much effort, too unnecessary for our life now. But it wasn't for my husband tonight. And the woman wearing it, she wasn't the same. I slid under the sheets, but I didn't sleep. My body hummed with restlessness. I could still feel him. The weight of his body near mine, the heat of his breath, the desperation in his kiss. I replayed it again and again, each time slower, deeper, as if memorizing the lines of a scene I knew I'd return to. I didn't regret it. Not the moment. Not the kiss. Not the way I said yes without saying the word. What terrified me wasn't what we'd done. It was how much I wanted it to happen again. I woke before the sun, disoriented and restless. The air in the bedroom felt heavier than usual, as though something invisible was hovering just above my chest. I stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the sound of the wind against the windows, the creaks of the old house adjusting to the cool morning. My husband's side of the bed was empty, the sheets still untouched. I'd made the bed perfectly the day before and never disturbed his half. The symmetry was almost painful. The day after the second kiss, the second decision, felt different. Not because anything had changed in the walls around me, or the furniture, or the routine. Everything looked exactly as it always did. The muted wallpaper in the hallway, the framed photos gathering dust on the shelf, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But something inside me had shifted. I could feel it in my pulse, in the way I moved, slower but more deliberate, like my skin had grown heavier overnight. He was already downstairs when I came into the kitchen. The newspaper lay open in front of him, untouched. A mug of coffee steamed between his hands, though he didn't drink from it. He glanced up when I entered, then quickly looked back down. There was no trace of the boy who had kissed me with both hands pressed firmly against my ribs, as though he were trying to memorize how I breathed. He was withdrawn now, quiet, cautious. "Morning," I said, barely louder than a breath. "Morning," he replied, without looking at me. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. The silence that filled the space between us was no longer thick with anticipation. It was different now. Sharp, tense, filled with questions we weren't ready to answer. He finally broke the quiet. "I shouldn't have done that. Last night." I stared at him, my hands wrapped around the warmth of my mug. His words didn't surprise me. They weren't even painful, just expected. "But you did," I said. "I know." We didn't speak again for several minutes. The air was awkward, as though the house itself had grown aware of us. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes felt amplified. "I think it's better if I keep my distance," he said, standing up. "At least for now, while he's still away." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a choice he was offering to me. I didn't argue. I didn't stop him. I simply nodded and watched him leave the kitchen, the back door closing gently behind him. That day, I cleaned. Not because the house needed it. It didn't. But because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, with my mind, with the ache that had settled somewhere between my shoulder blades and refused to ease. I stripped the sheets from the guest bed, vacuumed behind the furniture, organized drawers that no one ever opened. I scrubbed the oven, rearranged the spice rack, wiped down the inside of the fridge twice. I did everything I could to forget how it felt when his lips were on mine, how his hands had moved as though they'd been here before, as though my body had already told him where to go. But nothing helped. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, but not physically. My body moved like a puppet, while my mind ran in circles. I sat at the dining room table and opened my notebook, the one I used for shopping lists, home improvement ideas, the occasional sketch. I flipped to a blank page, and then I began to write. I wrote about the way he looked at me that first morning, the cautious curiosity in his eyes, about the way his voice dropped when we were alone, about the way my skin tingled for hours after he touched me. I wrote things I hadn't even said aloud to myself, things I didn't want to see written in my own handwriting, but I kept going. I wrote about how I didn't recognize myself anymore, not because I had changed, but because I had finally stopped hiding the parts that had always been there, the parts that wanted more, that ached to be touched not out of duty or habit, but out of hunger, tenderness, attention. I didn't hear him come in. His voice startled me. "What's that?" I looked up, heart thudding. He stood in the doorway holding a stack of mail, his hair tousled from the wind. "Nothing," I said too quickly, snapping the notebook shut. His eyes lingered on it. He didn't press. He walked past me to the counter, dropping the mail without sorting it. Then, without turning around, he said, "I'm not avoiding you because I regret anything." I didn't speak. "I'm avoiding you because I don't know how to want something this much and not ruin it." That stopped me. I stood slowly, the notebook still clutched in my hand. I approached him, step by step, until I was close enough to feel the warmth of his back. "You think this is something that can be protected?" I asked quietly. He turned to face me, and for a moment neither of us breathed. "I think I'll destroy you if I'm not careful," he said. I shook my head. I think I've already been ruined, long before you got here." He looked at me as though I'd just given him permission to exhale. I left the notebook on the counter and walked away, not because I wanted to end the moment, but because I couldn't bear the weight of it any longer. I needed to hold on to some illusion of control, even if just for an hour more. That night, I sat in the dark with a glass of wine, the living room lit only by the glow of a single lamp. I could hear him moving in the guest room, the soft creak of floorboards, the quiet opening and closing of drawers. I imagined him reading something, lying on his back, staring at the ceiling as I had the night before. The wine warmed me, but it didn't soften the longing. I stood and walked to the hall. His door was ajar, just slightly. I didn't go in. I didn't speak. I just stood there, hand resting on the frame, watching the sliver of light spill out from within. And I waited, just long enough to know he had heard me. Then I turned and walked back to my room. Alone, but not untouched. Not anymore. The morning was silent in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy on your shoulders, asking questions you've run out of excuses to answer. I stayed in bed longer than I usually allowed myself, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster with my eyes. My husband had left early again. He'd barely touched his coffee, had barely touched me in days. I knew he felt the distance between us widening. He just didn't know why. Or maybe he did, and chose not to confront it. Sometimes silence is more convenient than truth. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen like a stranger. My hands found cups, sugar, spoons, but I wasn't really there. I caught sight of my reflection in the oven door. My robe slightly open at the chest, my hair loose around my face, eyes darker than they used to be. I looked like someone I hadn't met before. Or maybe someone I had buried long ago. I found him on the back porch. He sat with his elbows on his knees, gaze lost somewhere beyond the garden, where the roses had started to wilt under the summer heat. He didn't turn when I opened the door, just said quietly, "He's going to figure it out eventually." I stood there a moment, barefoot on the threshold, unsure whether to step forward or go back. "He already has," I said. "He just doesn't want to admit it." He looked up at me then. "What happens now?" I didn't have an answer. We sat in silence for a long while. The porch creaked under our chairs, and a breeze moved through the yard, lifting dead leaves and letting them fall again. I stared at my hands. They didn't feel like mine. They'd held too many truths I couldn't speak, touched too many things I couldn't justify. "I never wanted to be this woman," I said finally. I never thought I'd be the one to make you her, he answered, just as quiet. There was no accusation in his voice, only weight, understanding. Later that afternoon, I told my husband I needed to run errands. He didn't ask what kind. I drove without knowing where I was going, turning down roads I hadn't taken in years, passing neighborhoods I didn't recognize anymore. Eventually, I ended up at the old state park outside of town, the one with the narrow trails and creaky observation deck that overlooked the lake. We used to go there before we were married, before life became scheduled and quiet. Back when silence between us had felt like comfort, not distance. I parked and walked down the path. My shoes kicked up small clouds of dust, and the sound of birds echoed somewhere high above. I didn't think about what I would do next. I just kept walking. He found me there. I don't know how he knew where I'd gone or why he followed, but he did. He came without a word, without a plan, just stood beside me on the deck and looked out over the water. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, its surface rippling gently as if it too was struggling to stay still. I read the rest of the journal, he said eventually. I didn't look at him. Then you know how far this has gone. Yes, he said. But I also know you didn't write about him. Not once. I turned my head. You wrote about yourself, he continued. About the woman you were before, about what you miss, what you remember, and about me. I felt my throat tighten. Because you make me feel like I'm allowed to want something again. He took a step closer. You are. The breeze lifted the scarf around my neck, the same one he had once said brought out the green in my eyes. His hand reached forward, just barely grazing the edge of the fabric before falling back to his side. I can't offer you stability, he said, or a plan, or anything that makes sense. I know. But if you asked me to stay, I would. There it was, laid bare between us. No seduction, no fantasy, just a decision, one that couldn't be unmade. I looked out over the lake again. Everything in me wanted to say yes, to say stay, to follow this path to wherever it would lead, no matter the cost. But life isn't a clean line. It's a knot. And I was tangled in it. That evening back at the house, I prepared dinner as usual. My husband came home, set his keys in the bowl by the door, greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. The smell of grilled vegetables filled the kitchen. Everything looked normal. After we ate, he asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said yes. We walked side by side through the neighborhood, our shadows stretching long across the pavement. He told me about a client who was giving him trouble. I listened. He asked how my day was. I lied. When we got back, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. I removed my earrings, wiped off my makeup, and stared into the eyes of a woman who was no longer sure who she belonged to. Later, when the house was dark, I stepped outside alone. The air was still warm and the sky had started to cloud. I walked barefoot across the grass, my robe tied loosely at the waist, the wind pulling at its hem. He was there, on the back steps, waiting. Not expectantly, but simply, waiting. I didn't say anything. I sat beside him, our shoulders almost touching. I have to make a choice, I said. I know. And either way, someone gets hurt. Yes. He didn't try to convince me. He didn't make promises. That's what made it harder. Why does it feel like no matter what I choose, I lose something I can't get back? Because you will. I looked up at the night sky, its vastness pressing down on me. And then I reached for his hand. Not to pull him toward me, not to hold on, but to say, I remember. I was here. We were real. I didn't know what I would say in the morning. I didn't know who I would wake up beside. But I knew that tonight, this last moment between what was and what would be, was mine.